Chapter 41, Genesis chapter 41. This is a long narrative tonight. You could break it up. I don't think you have to. We're just going to read it all. Here's something else I wanted to let you know. If you don't mind checking your emails, we have changed over to a new system to using Microsoft instead of Google, and some of the contacts did not switch over, and some of them that did, when people are sending emails. Now I fixed mine. You should be on our list of what I send out on the weekend and on Wednesdays. But if you did not get something from me today, first check your junk mail, because it may go there, and just mark it as it is not junk, and then you won't have that problem again. I wish email wasn't designed that way, but sometimes coming from a new system, it will go to the spam or the junk. But if you did not get it, please let me know. We'll make sure. But I'm looking around tonight. All of you are in it. I mean, I don't have it memorized, but I have enough memorized to know that all of you are in it. And so you should have gotten it, and if you didn't, you just need to go look in your junk folder. And if you don't know what a junk folder is, there's not much I can do to help you except bring your computer, and I'll help you, or somebody can help you, and hopefully you'll be getting the correspondence that you need. Tonight is a chapter where Joseph goes from the pit to the pinnacle, and that's just what I've named it. And this is not original with me. There's several people that have used this phrase. Chuck Swindoll has used it. Other people, because it's just a known fact. He was just in the pit. You know, we talk about where he started when his brothers cast him into the pit, and then, you know, obviously the dungeon and all of that. But then he rose to the second in command in Egypt, and that is chapter 41 in a nutshell of how that happened. And so we're just going to read and then talk a little bit about this, but. In chapter 41, we'll start in verse 1, and it says this: "And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. And so Pharaoh awoke. And he slept and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, and I and he, we dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was there with us a young man, a Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted it to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself, and changed his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it, and I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, In my dream, behold, I stood the bank upon the bank of the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and the ill-favored kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine, and when they had eaten them, it could not be known that they had eaten them. But they were still ill-favored, and as at the beginning, so I awoke. And I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 ears, withered, thin, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears, and I was told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years, and the dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. And there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice, it is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh. And let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, forasmuch as God hath shown thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures with fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the 2nd chariot which he had, and they cried before him, bow the knee, and he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zapnath-paneah, and he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. And Joseph went out all over the land of Egypt, and Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls, and he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, the food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much until he left numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God said, he hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second called he Ephraim, for for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And the 7 years of plenteous that there was in the land of Egypt were ended. And the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said, and the dearth was in all the land, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all the countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all the lands. That's a long story that really doesn't tell us a whole lot, other than it sort of repeats what God had said in the dreams and then how Pharaoh handled it. It's not that it doesn't teach us a lot, it's a lot of verses that tell a very brief story. 7 years of famine, or plenty, 7 years of famine. Joseph had found favor with God. He was able to interpret the dreams. Pharaoh called him in. When he did it, Joseph recommended that he find a man that could oversee this famine, this time of famine and this time of plenty. And Pharaoh saw the Spirit of God, and we'll say this in a minute in a more organized way, but he saw Joseph as a man who had the Spirit of God on him, and he saw him as a man who was wise and discreet. And so he chose Joseph. It's interesting to me, just a few things that I really didn't put in the lesson is, here's another time that a man tells Joseph, I'm going to put you over my house, and the only one greater is me. That's the second time that's happened. This time, it's much greater than Potiphar. If you thought Potiphar was powerful, the Pharaoh at this point was even more powerful. And so now Joseph has gone from the dungeon, he's gone from the pit at probably age 17, 13 years later, he's at the pinnacle of the world, and the only man greater than him in the world at this time, because Pharaoh in Egypt was pretty much dominating the world at this time in history. The only man that was greater than Joseph was Pharaoh, and that was when he was on the throne. And so that's the story. That pretty much is the story of it. And so we're going to we're just going to look at what this is actually teaching us, and these dreams given by Pharaoh. One of the things that I want you to remember is that, let me ask you this. They tell us that we all dream, right? All of us have dreams. And most of our dreams are probably, due to what's in our subconscious, what we've watched, what we've talked about. Sometimes it can be other things. Sometimes we don't even know. They say we have several dreams a night, and most of us don't remember, everything that we dreamed. Sometimes we don't remember any of them, if that's true. But, and you don't have to tell us. I just want to know, how many of you tonight remember the last dream you had? Anybody remember the last dream you had? The last one. Do you remember what it was about? Again, I'm not asking you to tell it. I just want to know if there's anybody that remembers their last dream. Well, the reason I say that is because the dreams here were different than what we normally dream. Now, I'm not going to put God in a box and say that he could never speak to us in a dream. I believe he could if he chose to do that. And he did choose to do that here. These were dreams that were given by God to really warn and prepare Pharaoh. Pharaoh, this is what I'm getting ready to do. And yet Pharaoh could not, he couldn't interpret it. And neither could his people. Now, I thought it was interesting that, God is always going to make sure that his name is glorified. He's not going to let people take the credit. And I thought it was interesting in my study, over the last few days, that many believe that just like God gave and put this dream into Pharaoh's mind and Pharaoh during his sleep, that he also blocked the thoughts of Pharaoh's top people so that they couldn't interpret it. Now, we don't know that, But they had shared with Pharaoh things before that he had dreamed. That's what he would call them in for, but this time they couldn't. And it's interesting that Joseph answers Pharaoh and the people who come to get him is that it wasn't in him to do this. This was God that was going to do this. And so, what do we learn? What do we learn from this? What do we learn from a story about a Pharaoh dreaming, even though we know the dreams were really important because it talked about 14 years of what was going to happen in Egypt. And so, what are some of the things? Well, let's just talk about some things by way of introduction, and then we'll draw some conclusions. The character attributes of Joseph mark the periscope. Joseph was patient in waiting on God's time. He was courageous in living out his convictions. Now, we're talking about between the ages of 17 and now in this story. He was courageous in living out his convictions. He was diligent to carry out the plan God had revealed to him. And he lived such an exemplary life that Pharaoh noticed. Pharaoh was a pagan, but he noticed something different. By the way, isn't that the way it's supposed to be? Shouldn't the pagan realize something different about the God-fearing man and woman? Certainly. And so, even though Pharaoh was a pagan and did not worship Joseph's God, he could see the Spirit of God in him, and he remembered the faithfulness of God to him. That's what Joseph did as well. Not only did Pharaoh see the Spirit of God in him, but Joseph remembered God's faithfulness to him. And so, when Pharaoh mentioned Joseph, two things had been mentioned. He said, I'm looking for somebody basically that's discerning and wise, and I'm looking for somebody that has the Spirit of God on them. And Joseph was that man. But there was a reason. I like what Donald Gray Barnhouse said, the great preacher at the 10th Street Presbyterian Church years ago in Philadelphia, said this: the secret of power is character, but the secret of character is God. God is the one that developed the character in Joseph's life. Joseph's walk with God developed the character. By the way, we will never develop the character that we ought to have as godly men and women unless we're walking with God. Ever. Oh, I mean, we can, at least what God reveals is character. We might have some characteristics that are good and wholesome. But the characteristics that Joseph had in order to be able to rise from the pit to the pinnacle were those godly traits, those godly characteristics that could only come because he had an intimate relationship with God. But here's something else we've got to remember in this passage, and I think we have to remember this in anything we study in the Bible. As exemplary as Joseph was in this passage, the text is about God and not about Joseph. This is not a passage about Joseph. Joseph just happens to be one of the main characters. But God was in the process of carrying out his plan. The hand of God was on Joseph, even when he was oppressed. The Spirit of God was evident in Joseph's life. The wisdom of God was revealed to Joseph. The goodness of God was manifested in Joseph's life. Let me ask you a question. If you take one character out of this narrative that changes the whole character, the whole narrative, who is it? It's God. You can take Joseph out. God could found another man. You could take Pharaoh out. There'd have been another Pharaoh. You can take, anybody out of this scenario. But God's plan was to use Joseph, and if you take God out of the equation, it leaves us with nothing. By the way, in our lives, you leave God out of the plan for your life, and you end up empty with nothing. You see, sometimes believers struggle in the waiting times. 17 years from the pit to the pinnacle. I don't know about you. I know I can look back on the life of my children and go, man, that went by fast. 34 years for my oldest son. 30, yeah, that went by, or 33. That went by like that. But 17 years in a dungeon, 17 years in a pit. And I know some of those, he was not enslaved. Some of that, he was in Potiphar's house. I get that. But he wasn't in his choice environment. He still wasn't with his family. Think about this. Even in Joseph's success, in Potiphar's house, as an Egyptian prince, he still wasn't with his family. He had still been taken away from everything he had ever known. So while God was blessing him in his affliction, Joseph probably longed to know what was going on with his family. But sometimes we struggle in waiting times. But when we are waiting on God to carry out what He said He would do, and when we are living in the parentheses moments between what God said and He would do and the fulfillment of His word, that sometimes can be very, very difficult. Sometimes we struggle. But here is a really simple statement that I think we need to be able to realize is we can trust God's timing in our lives. Do you ever go through something that you go, Lord, why now? Why did this happen now? Why did this happen? Why is this scenario like it is right now? But we can trust God with His timing. When you think about what He experienced with the cupbearer and the butler, Joseph could have said, why now? Why would you not allow that guy to remember me so I could get out of prison? And I think this is what God maybe have whispered to Joseph if he communicated like this. It's not time. It's not time yet. This is not my timing. And let me just remind you that even though God is a good God, God is not on our time. God is on His time. And He gets to choose when and where and how and why. And the question is, will we trust Him for that? So when we are waiting on God to complete His purpose in our lives, we can live in confidence that what He is doing or allowing in our lives can be used to accomplish His purpose. One of the hardest things we do is, Lord, I don't understand, but if it is accomplishing your purpose, I will wait, or I will go through this. But sometimes when we can't see what the purpose is, and the truth is, I'm learning every day of my life, I may never see that till eternity. I may never understand. I may die trusting the Lord, but never seeing the completion of His plan in a particular area. I'll see it if I'm looking at it from eternity's viewpoint, but I may never see it this side of heaven. The question is, will I trust Him when I cannot see it? Because faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things what? Not seen. Not things that are tangible and seen. And so Joseph is, even here, there's no evidence that Joseph was trying to get Pharaoh to pick him. But Joseph did have the wisdom enough to say, Pharaoh, here's what you need to do if you're going to make it through this time of famine. And you're going to be prepared. You need to find somebody that you can put over the king. Well, it was just natural probably for Pharaoh to go, you know what, there's been nobody on this planet that's been able to give me any answers. I see the Spirit of God in you. I see the favor you have, that God has, that you have with your God, and I'm going to choose you. And so, here again, what do we learn? What do we learn from this story? What can we take with us tonight and go, Lord, there's some things in my life, either there have been, there is right now, or there's going to be some things in my life, and this is what I can learn from this story. I think there are many things we can learn. I suggest 4. While we are waiting, number 1, while we are waiting on God to fulfill His purpose, we should continue to live lives of faithfulness. Do you know that even in the church culture today, we've redefined faithfulness? We've redefined faithfulness. We've redefined it in involvement in the church. We've redefined it in our prayer lives. We've redefined it in our study of the Bible. Some people think it's faithful if they just read their Bible 2 or 3 times a week. We've redefined it in witnessing. We've redefined it in living holy. God didn't just want you to live holy on one day. He wants you to try to live holy every day. God doesn't just want you to be in His Word one day. He wants you to be faithful to Him every day. You know, I know this is not a perfect example, but all of you in here, I think, except for Callie, is married. But I could let Callie be in on this too, because her mom and dad are here. What if the people that you are closest to tonight, and most of us, that would be our spouse, and then for somebody like Callie, it would be her parents. What if all of us just didn't speak to that one person or those 2 people that meant the most to us? What if we just never talked to them? What if we were not faithful to communicate with them? What do you think would happen? Well, it wouldn't be pleasant. You'd wonder what's wrong. There certainly wouldn't be any closeness, you know. But what if you said like the guy that said, well, I told my wife I loved her when we got married, and if that changes, I'll let her know. You know. And I've heard that for years as a little funny story. But you know, there are people that don't realize the importance of every day looking at your spouse and going, I just want you to know, no matter what, I love you. That's important. And if you don't, look, men, I'll pick on us tonight. If you don't think that's important, ask your wife. They'll tell you it's important. But the truth is, if we'll be honest, we like it when our wives tell us that they love us and that they appreciate us. You know, what do you say, what are you trying to, I'm not trying to give a marriage seminar tonight. I'm simply saying we have redefined faithfulness. Faithfulness is steady. Joseph was steady Eddie, if you will, during this whole process. It's not that he was perfect. God didn't reveal every struggle Joseph had. I'm sure he had struggles. I'm sure at times he cried out to the Lord and asking why and had to deal with his attitude. I'm sure of that because he was made of flesh. But he did remain faithful, and I believe the Bible points that out very vividly. He remained faithful, and he remained in a position where he would trust the Lord. And I will just tell you that one of the things, here's one of the things that I struggle with, and I don't quite know how to help people over the years as I've been a pastor. I do not understand why people's faithfulness wanes when they are going through difficult times. If there is ever a time that you need God and His people, it's when you are going through difficult times. And you don't have to spill the beans, and you don't have to come and tell everybody your whole life story unless you want to. But I'm amazed at how many people, the first place they cut out of their lives is God's people, God's house, their relationship with God. And I'm just going to, this may offend people. I don't think it will offend the people sitting in here tonight. But I'm going to tell you something. You can't say that you love God supremely and not love His church. No matter where you are, Christ died for the very thing that people run away from. And all this is here tonight. This is not the church. This is not the church. We are the church. Church is people. You're the temple. This is not a temple. This is just a nice place where the church can gather. But I'm often perplexed by how little it takes for people to become unfaithful to the church and to God. Secondly, while we are waiting on God to fulfill His purpose, we should demonstrate courage in our convictions. I remember I remember as a little, well, I wouldn't say a little boy. I can remember, Callie, let's just pick on Callie tonight. I'm sorry. But I can remember when I was Callie's age. Callie's getting to that point where I'm sure her parents have already told her, and you've told your kids, they may already be grown and gone. But I can remember when my parents used to say, you're going to have to stand up on your own 2 feet about some stuff. We're going to be there to support you. But I came to a point in my life, I was probably a little older, I was probably in high school, but I remember one time being ashamed when I said to somebody, I can't do that because my parents won't let me do that. Any of you ever do that when you were a young Christian? I can't do that because my mom and dad won't let me do that. I remember the first time that I ever told somebody, I can't go to your booze party because the Lord would be displeased with me. I'm going to keep myself pure because the Lord would be displeased with me. It didn't have anything to do with my mom and daddy. Now, I'd have been in trouble with my mom and daddy, for sure. But I had to learn, in other words, I had to learn to be courageous in my convictions. One of the things Joseph was the whole time between Potiphar's house, really the pit, from being sold into slavery to the pinnacle when he was second in command in Egypt, is he did not waver in his courage to stand on the principles that he had learned about holiness and about God. He said that to Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife, I don't care how much power I have in this house, you're not mine. And we're not going to do this because it is against God. He didn't say, I'm afraid we'll get caught. He didn't say, well, my daddy taught me better than that. He could have said all that and it had been true. But he was quick for it to be a conviction. In other words, as we walk with the Lord, we ought to know what we're about, what we're not about. And I'm not talking about preference. There are some things that people are going to differ on. But let me tell you something. When it comes to the principles of the Bible, there shouldn't be a whole lot of difference. There may be some things that, the Bible talks about work out your own salvation in fear and trembling. Paul mentioned that, there were some things he couldn't do, but, all things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. He didn't condemn people for doing some things he said he wouldn't do. I get that. But I don't think that's with most things. Especially when it comes to temptation and immorality and those kind of things, we need to be courageous in our convictions, even while we're waiting on God to fulfill His purpose in our lives. Because let me tell you something, one bad choice can really ruin. It's not that God can't restore, but it can alter what God wanted to do in your life with one wrong choice. And I'm thankful that all choices aren't that way. We all make bad choices. But there are some choices out there that if we don't have courage in our convictions, it can set the pattern and the direction of a life for the rest of their lives. Number 3, while we are waiting on God to fulfill His purpose, we should trust the future that God is working out for us. I'm grateful after this September 6th, I'll be 58. I've been saved 53 of those years. I was saved as a 5-year-old little boy. But I am grateful now that I know a little more than I knew when I was 5, that God did not show me everything that was going to happen in the last 53 years. I'm not sure I'd be here tonight. And I'm just being honest. I'm not sure that I would have said yes to God with some of the things that my life has brought. I hope I would have, but that's the reason God doesn't show us. He wants us to trust Him one day at a time, one moment at a time. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not unto your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. He will direct your path. But sometimes He does that just moment by moment, day by day, week by week, month by month, and year by year. And so, do you trust Him for the future? I don't know about you, and we have people in here tonight that are younger than me and some that are older than me. But those of you that are older than me, and I'll join you in this, you've probably thought about the end of your life more at this stage of your life than you did when you were a young person. Do you trust the Lord with your exit from this world? I've had to think about that. Some of you have had to think about that. Maybe all of you have. You know, do you trust Him with that future? And if you can trust Him with your eternal soul, you can trust Him for anything. There's nothing more important than your eternal soul. And so, we have to trust Him with our future. Lord, I don't know what the future holds, but it's in your hands. Most of you love that song. If you've ever heard it once, I'm sure you love it. I know who holds tomorrow. I know He holds the future. I know He holds tomorrow. I know He holds my hand. I know I'm in His grip. His eye is never off of me. I can trust Him. And then number 4. While we are waiting on God to fulfill His purpose, we should continue to allow the Spirit of God to be evident in us. You know what waiting can do? It can put you in a foul mood. It can put you in a, if you will, a spiritual slump, and your attitude can show forth. I'm not sure if this is a perfect example, because it's a small example of things we go through every day. But one of the things I asked my wife when she got back from the DMV the other day is I said, would people know that you're a Christian and a pastor's wife after what you just went through? She said, yes, I want you to know you'd have been proud, but that's because I didn't let what was on the inside out to the outside. But she went, and I don't think she'll mind me telling you, she went to the DMV and she's getting her real ID. And that's a little more difficult than getting your regular driver's license. But she read it and did all that, took all the information, and the first guy she showed it to said, ma'am, you've got everything you need. She walked out 3.5 hours later with no real ID because the lady at the window said, I can't take this. They would not take the document that they sent us because it was not in the original windowed envelope that they mailed it in. That's what they told her. Do you have the original windowed envelope? She said, I don't have a clue. I opened this mail and she had everything else, but here was another thing. They wouldn't take my deed to the house for proof of residency. Had her name. It said they'd take a deed, but the lady said, it has 2019. I said, ma'am, I can't help when I bought the house. It was in my trust. You know, even little things like that, can people see the Spirit of God? Can we walk away from those kinds of things? We could talk about big things, but even in the little things, because that's where we normally live, is in the day in and day out little things of our lives. Can we walk away and they go, you know, something's different about that person. Man, they didn't throw a fit. Because I guarantee you, that DMV lady has probably had 100,000 people over the years to get upset with her, and some of them probably cuss her out. But can every situation, can people see that we are controlled by the Holy Spirit? And I think Joseph, that was evident in the pagan Pharaoh, that he saw that in Joseph. What a great testimony. Wouldn't you like to have a testimony where a pagan would say, you know what, I know that guy, I know that gal, and I don't know how, but I see something different. I see the Spirit of God in them. He didn't even know God. God revealed it, I believe, that to Pharaoh, that Joseph was his man. So that's what we learn. How do we apply it? Very quickly. Number 1, when God carries out His purpose in our lives, we need to remember what He's done for us. You know, one of the things we ought to do every day is just reminisce over all the things that we can that God has done for us, especially recently. But that's just a good thing to do every once in a while. Lord, thank you for doing this. Thank you for meeting this need. Thank you for for the sunshine. Thank you for the rain. Thank you for this and that. You know, I see what you've done. Thank you for answering this prayer. Just when He's carrying out our purposes and we're having to wait, remember what He's done for you. Here's one that's hard. Okay, you ready? Let the past be the past. You say, what do I mean by that? Now notice, I want you to notice how I phrased it. I didn't say just get over it. Sometimes your past becomes a part of your DNA that you have to live with the rest of your life in a good or bad way. But you're a new creature in Christ, given a new life with a new relationship with the Father. Don't let your past plague your presence or your present. You have new life in Christ if you have given your life to Jesus in faith. And only God strengthens us to let the past be the past. Only God does that. Again, we can learn from our past, we can share our testimony from the past, but it doesn't have to plague us. I like the book we read years ago called Getting Past What You Will Never Get Over. There are some things in people's past, maybe even in your own, that you will always remember. It will always be a part of you, but you don't have to let it plague your present. Number 3, God is able to make us forget our hardships. We don't always forget them. God has promised one way that He is going to do that, and this is what He said. And I love this. Paul said when he wrote to the Romans, he said, "For I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." You know what he's saying? Take the very worst scenario in your life, and that is not even compared to being bad enough in comparison to how good it will be in glory. In other words, it's almost like, you ever been out in the 110 degree weather and you go, this is ridiculous. And you're sweating and you're mowing and you're working in the yard and your air conditioner don't work in the car or whatever, and you're doing something that you have to do in the heat, and you're going and you think it's the worst condition you've ever been, and then all of a sudden you get in that nice cool house where the air conditioner's blowing and it almost put icicles on your earlobes. That's sort of what he's saying in a nutshell. The conflict that we go through, the tribulation we go through, there's nothing to compare to that compared to the glory that it will be in eternity. And then the last thing, don't give up your faith in Jesus. You don't know. I hope nobody's in the pit tonight. I don't know that, but I hope you're not. I hope you don't feel like you're in the pit. But you might know somebody in the pit. You might feel like you're climbing out of the pit. You might feel like you're just in a little dip. But don't give up your faith. And you do not know what day that you will be pulled out of the pit. Joseph had no way of knowing he would go from the dungeon to second in command. Can you imagine? With a ring on his finger and vestures on his body and being able to tell, everybody answered to him. Everybody bowed to him. And the only way Pharaoh was more powerful than him was when he was on his throne. That's incredible. By the way, that's not a fictional story. That happened. There are even biblical archaeology findings that will prove that some of these things are evident. We don't have to, not that we need them because it's in the Word. That's all we need. But people that try to discredit it, they've already been proven that they can't discredit what the Scripture says. This was a real story. In fact, I love, Joseph was a type of Christ. And in verse 55, Pharaoh said to the Egyptians that were crying because they were hungry and didn't have bread, "Go unto Joseph." They didn't have anything. It was a famine. Go unto Joseph and do what he says do. You know what the world needs to hear that's crying out because they're broken and don't know where to turn? They need to hear, go to Jesus and do what he said to do. That's what they need. Just like the Egyptians, we're told to go to Joseph and he'll feed you. He'll sell you what you would normally be able to buy at the market, because he was wise and discreet, and he was discerning, and he knew how to manage, and God gave him that wisdom. That wasn't something Joseph knew how to do on his own. God taught him that in his walk with him, and he managed, and he built up, and he stored up grain in all these coffers, and he was able to, eventually we're going to see even his own family, even Israel, benefited from Joseph's wisdom and work. And the world just needs to hear, you know what? If you go to Jesus, you got everything you need. He's got everything you need. And just do what he says. We just studied Paul's conversion. You know, that's just what in our D group, a little Bible study that I have each week, we just studied Acts 9, and one of the things that Paul said was, Lord, what would you have me do? He went, now Jesus came to him on that one, but he was trying to accomplish his will. But really what the world needs is to go to Jesus. We need to point them to Jesus, just like Pharaoh pointed them to Joseph. And we need to tell people, Jesus has got the answer. Just do what he asks you to do. And so that's what I got out of this to share with you tonight. Any thoughts, any questions? There's probably 100 other lessons in such a long story. There wasn't a lot of, it seemed like a lot of detail because it was 57 verses, but it really wasn't. The story was repeated twice, and then we just see what Pharaoh did with Joseph. And there's some interesting things about the name change and how it pointed to him being a type of Christ and the characteristics of all of what the name meant. And there's some interesting things like that. But any thoughts, any questions? Well, yes, got two here. Go ahead.
Mine was just a funny observation with the wife that he was given was from the house of Potiphar. I don't know if that was the common name or if that was a relative of Potiphar.
To be honest, I don't know. I did not get into that, but I could certainly find out or try to find out.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Same name.
And Pharaoh was not going to give up his Egyptian, things, names and those kind. It was obvious at that point. There was a lot of things that Joseph probably had to deal with, being a Hebrew, but yet given the Egyptian power and the power of a Pharaoh, he would not have been looked favorably upon as a Hebrew in this point. But Pharaoh looked on him favorably and made him, basically if Pharaoh said it, you did it, whether everybody else liked it or not. So, Keith?
I just never looked at the aspect of God shutting off the knowledge of the magicians or the whatever. And what brought to mind was, I guess this is a long topic, but what in Pentecost was the miracle on the ear or the mouth?
Well, I think the miracle was they heard, the Bible says they heard in their own language. I don't know that speaking in tongues meant they could speak in all those different languages. You can only let so many words come out of your one mouth. And as Peter spoke, I believe he spoke in tongues, and what the miracle was on Pentecost, and the Bible says it right there, they heard, each man heard, or each one heard in their own language. Yeah. Now, when the gift of tongues was exercised in the body of Christ, as they began to meet in certain people groups, obviously, sometimes that might have been the ability for somebody to speak in a language that they did not, that they couldn't. But most people would have had, in the other places they went, most people would have had one dialect, or one people group would have had one language at that point. That's not even true today. You can go to people in, and even Wycliffe will tell you they can go out to the jungles and there's all kinds of languages among the people. They understand it, but nobody else does. but they don't even speak the same dialect many times. But what interested me is we don't have any proof that happened with those guys, but they had been able to answer things in the past, and that's what Pharaoh would do, is he would call on them. The writer that I read after was trying to make the point that God wasn't going to let anybody take the credit except him, because he knew Joseph was going to say, God's the one that'll reveal this to you, not me. It's not in me. Joseph knew it wasn't in him to do that, but he knew God could do it through him. And by the way, that's a great example for us today. There's nothing in us that we can do without the Spirit of God that's going to mean anything to us or to God or to the work of the kingdom. So, and I will say again, as I did Sunday, everything you do, everything we do, no matter what it is, our work, our play, our church, our witnessing, everything ought to be done under the influence of the Spirit. Not just what we do in church, or not just when we're speaking the word or witnessing this. Everything we do is an act of worship and should be under the control of the Spirit. Yes, Bob?
I just find it interesting that obviously Joseph could have been pretty unhappy that the chief butler didn't, carry out the promise that he thought he did.
Yeah.
But it shows God's time and everything on how, what happens to us today. Further on, you don't know how that's going to result in things in the future.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times we get impatient with something that, in the long term may work for our good, even though we don't see it now.
Well, and isn't it interesting that Joseph didn't, as far as we know, there was no retaliation when he became second in command. We don't know all that happened, but it doesn't fit his character. Let's just say that, to do that. Anything else? All right, let's stand together and we'll pray. And Keith, I'm going to ask you, if you would, to close us in prayer tonight.